Welcome to Hanging My Tree with Rev James Buchan. I wouldn't say that James, the Reverend, was a famous man, but due to his religious and charitable works, he would have been influential in his time. He frequently appeared in the newspapers. He was the first in his family from Scotland to immigrate, and he chose to immigrate to Australia. He wasn't a young man when he chose to start his and his family's life on the other side of the world. In Scotland and Australia, he made an impact on the community and had a legacy in his 9 children, their children, and now his great-great-great-grandchildren. James was born in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, Scotland on 14 June 1848. There's an extract from the Old Parish Record Register of Births of Fraserburgh. He was the son of William Buchan, a fisherman, and Elizabeth Duthie. Fraserburgh is a coastal town in Aberdeenshire in the county of Buchan. It is situated close to the towns of Rathen and Peterhead. Fraserburgh is now a fishing port and is apparently the biggest shellfish port in Scotland and one of the largest in Europe. I can confirm some of the Reverend's siblings by DNA connections. I'm confident that he had 4 siblings: Isabella, William, John, and Elsbeth. A number of other trees on Ancestry include other siblings, but I'm not satisfied that these were the children of William Buchan and Elizabeth Duthie. It appears the Reverend may have been the youngest child of William and Elizabeth. My research suggests that the Reverend was the only one of his siblings to leave Aberdeen and to live in a different country. The Reverend married Christian Buchan and they had 9 children. I encourage you to watch the videos about the Reverend's wife Christian Buchan and their son George Rutherford Rudd Buchan, as they'll provide you more of the story of the Reverend's life. There are a number of census records that tell us some interesting things about the family. The 1851 records show that James lived at Shaw Street, Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire with his parents and siblings. In 1851, Isabella, his sister, was 22 years of age and was already married with her own son James, so she didn't appear on this census. Similarly, his brother William wasn't recorded, but he was 18 years of age. As an aside, he apparently married his second cousin Margaret Buchan a few years later in 1856. John and Elsbeth are also recorded as members of the household in this census. Like it sounds, Shaw Street is on the waterfront. Even today, there are 2 significant nods to the fishermen of years past: the Canberg Fisherman Memorial Statue and Maggie's Hussey. Maggie's Hussey is a restored cottage to show the lives of fisherwomen. There were earthen floors, no electricity or running water. Inside the home, the family would have prepared and baited the fishing lines, cured, smoked, salted and dried fish. It's actually the house of Maggie Duthie. I'm not sure whether or not she was related to the Reverend's mother. The only significant difference in the 1861 census is the Reverend, who was 11 years, is reported to be a scholar and his mother a fisherman's wife. In 1869, his mother died. It was clear the Reverend wasn't going to be a fisherman. In 1869 to 1870, he completed a pre-matriculation course at the Glasgow University. In 1870, he completed a Master of Arts at St Andrew's College and the Edinburgh Theological Hall. He won prizes in English literature, natural philosophy, and New Testament Greek. In 1871, he was a member of the Fraserburgh Congregational Church in Mid Street. Congregationalism, according to the Britannica, was a Christian movement that started in England in the 16th and 17th century. Theologically, it sits somewhere between Presbyterianism, Baptist or Quakers. A congregation had the responsibility to determine its own affairs without a higher authority, so there were no bishops. Each church is an independent and autonomous body. The Congregational Church ceased to exist in Australia in 1977, and many of the congregations formed the Uniting or Methodist churches. The Congregational Church was the first church in Australia to ordain a female in 1927. In 1874, he was ordained into the ministry and worked at the Broomknoll Street Congregational Church at Airdrie. Airdrie, Scotland is near Glasgow. It's quite a distance from Aberdeenshire. Today in a car it would take about 4 hours. Airdrie is a town that came into prominence as a weaving town and then a coal mining town. In the 1840s, Airdrie had enormous population growth due to the influx from the highlands and Ireland following the potato famine. In letters he made, observations about the hard life of a coal miner and the effects of alcohol shaped the way that he ministered his flock. In his early years at Broomknoll Street Church, the church was rebuilt and the manse was built. On 5 October 1875, the Reverend and Christian travelled back to Fraserburgh in Aberdeenshire to be married. Between 1877 and 1880, his daughters, Maggie, Lizzie, and the twins, Anne and Christine, were born in Airdrie. By 1881, the census tells us that the Reverend was 31 years of age, that he and Christian were living at Roseville, Airdrie. The Reverend's occupation was a minister of Congregational. They recorded Congregational Chapel. At that stage, Margaret, Elizabeth, and the twins, Christina and Annie, reside in the home. And Elizabeth Buchan, 23 years, also was included in the census. The Reverend remained working at the church at Airdrie for 11 years until he retired in 1884, aged 36 years, of ill health. He made a plan to move to New South Wales, Australia, due to his failing health. There is a record of Reverend James Buchan leaving Gravesend, England, to Sydney, Australia, on the ship Khedive, noting that he was contracted to land in Melbourne. There's a record of the Reverend travelling on the ship Coonawarra from Melbourne to New South Wales on the 25th of May 1885. He arrived in Sydney on the 28th of May 1885. The Reverend was a saloon passenger and not a steerage passenger. A saloon passenger was the equivalent of a first-class passenger today. When the Reverend travelled to Australia, he travelled ahead of his family. When he left, his wife Christian was pregnant with the couple's first son, Jim. Jim was the last of Reverend's children that was born in Scotland. Christian travelled to Australia with Elizabeth Buchan, who acted as a servant. Elizabeth was a niece of the couple who appeared in the earlier census. There are a number of New South Wales Government gazettes recording that the Reverend was registered as a minister for the celebration of marriages in the Congregational Church. When the Reverend arrived at Pyrmont Congregational Church, it was a little brick building in Allen Street, Pyrmont. Like in Airdrie, the first years of his ministry involved building a new elegant church. In 1885, he began a campaign to build a church. In 1887 and 1888, his sons John and William were born in Pyrmont, Sydney, Australia. John reportedly being born in the manse of the church. In 1888, 2 memorial stones were laid in the building of the church on the corner of Allen and Harris Streets, Pyrmont. On 21 September 1889, there was an article in the Australian Town and Country about the building of Pyrmont Congregational Church, including a detailed description of the church and an article about the Reverend. It said, Reverend James comes from a good Aberdeen congregational stock and possesses a high degree of those qualities of his race that Dr. Dale described in the Admiration, where they are not in terror of the rest of mankind. His power of sustained effort has been characteristic of him throughout his public career. With no other educational advantages than those possessed by youths at the Public School of Scotland, he qualified himself in entering university at 19. He matriculated in Glasgow. In his congregation in Airdrie, a new parsonage was erected. The church was enlarged and rebuilt, and the congregation more than doubled. In 1885, signs of failing health compelled him to consider the desirableness of a change of residence. After much thought, he determined to come to New South Wales, and the change appeared to be exactly what was required. Soon after his arrival to the colony, his health so completely restored that he took charge of the Pyrmont Congregational Church, which has seen an ever-increasing attendance, the necessity of which has seen the need to erect a more permanent and larger structure. The new church was completed in 1889. Once his new church was completed, the Reverend moved into Temperance, the Ragged Schools, the Sydney City Mission, the Band of Hope, Save the Children organisation. It seems that the Reverend didn't just preach, but made actual efforts to try and improve the world. The Sydney City Mission was originally organised to promote religion without reference to a denomination, and missionaries were to spend 30 hours a week attending homes to bring people to an acquaintance with salvation. They provided assistance to the poor. Newspaper reports indicate the provision of food and clothing and visits and medicine to the sick. On 11 June 1898, there was talk of the winter appeal. The Reverend's whole family was actively involved in the rag schools, providing education to the poor. A newspaper article dated the 11th of January 1897, which really demonstrates how different the times were with class divisions, no free education and no real welfare system. The article contains a circular issued by the Reverend. The Sydney Rag Schools were founded in 1860 for children so poor and destitute of decent clothing that they could not mix with children in public schools. There are now 5 schools open daily in Glebe, Waterloo, Harrington Street, Brisbane Street and Woolloomooloo, with 504 students in total. There are no fees or charges of any kind. The doors are open to every poor and neglected child. But for the school, those 504 children will be left to roam the streets and wharves, uncared for and unhelped, a prey on the most pernicious influences. There are 9 teachers. They visit the homes and frequently children are supplied with clothing, gifts of friends and with food. No pecuniary aid is received from the government. The schools have been entirely supported by the public during the 36 years of their existence. The expenditure is about £800 per annum. The Temperance organisation was a grassroots movement that promoted the complete abstinence from alcohol. It was one of the first public activities that women had an active and almost equal role to men. They battled with the liquor trade. The Band of Hope was an interdenominational education group that worked with adults and children, encouraging abstinence from alcohol. There are letters to the editor written by the Reverend. One on the 9th of May 1891 in particular talks about his dissatisfaction of publicans breaking the law by opening their public houses on Sunday. The Reverend suggested that no back doors should be allowed on public houses. He said, "In the large town of Scotland, a centre of a populous district in which I laboured for many years, there were no back doors allowed on the public houses. It was an impossibility to sell in prohibited hours." He goes on to say, "It is well known that the evil lies for the most part in the number of poor men who leaf around public houses almost the whole day, getting drink while they have anything left to pay for it, or while they can get others to do it. The only ones who do not or will not see are those who seek to serve themselves at the expense of the wrong, and the poor men whose craving for drink cannot keep themselves away from the places where they think it can be obtained. In the name of all that is merciful, let the doors be kept shut." Very ironically, the Reverend was the grandfather of Isabel Buchan, who married Roy Lang. Roy's grandfather was Henry Peter Christopher Lang. You may recall from an earlier Hanging in My Tree video that Henry liked a drink, had his fair share of trouble with women and the law. It's probably fortunate that neither of them attended the wedding of the couple, as I imagine it would have been an awkward family meet. On 26 April 1891, my great-grandfather, Ernest Buchan, was born. The Sydney City Archives have a letter from the Reverend to the Council from March 1896 complaining about the erection of horse stables adjacent to the church. On 17 August 1899, there is a report in the Daily Telegraph titled "Shocking Tragedy at Ultimo, Love and Jealousy, a Man and 2 Women Shot." The story talks about a tragedy at Fig Tree Street, Pyrmont, when Frederick Gilbert, an accountant 36 years of age, shot 3 persons and attacked a 4th and endeavoured to take his own life. A girl, Eliza Absalon, the sister of the other 2 women, narrowly escaped. The newspaper reported that when Miss Absalon was interviewed, it was with the greatest difficulty that she could speak of the sad affair, and that she was supported by Reverend Buchan. The article notes that Miss Absalon and her family belonged to the Church of England, and she had requested to see a clergyman, but the Church of England minister was not available. Reverend Buchan was approached and immediately went to the unfortunate girl. In January 1909, there is a newspaper article about the Reverend attending Edinburgh as the delegate of the Congregational International Council. The article reports that the Reverend was greatly interested in the work carried out in the social and moral improvement of the poor, and paid inspection and visit to several centres of these agencies. At Airdrie, Scotland, where he served as a minister for 10 years, he renewed many old friendships. His journey outside England and Scotland in visits to Rome and Palestine. In 1909, there is a newspaper article welcoming back the Reverend after he attended Europe. A meeting was held to talk about the work done in the Reverend's absence. It was reported that a group of men who were called the Buchan's Brigade had entirely completed the church's renovations. There are a few other activities that we know from the newspapers that the Reverend was engaged with. There is also a photograph with the Reverend with a church football team with his son Ernest, who was the team treasurer. We also know that the Reverend gave lectures from the church in the evenings. One lecture was reported in 1898, being on Cuba and the Spanish-American War. World War I commenced in July 1914, and 3 of the Reverend's sons, John, William and Rudd, enlisted to the war. On the 11th of April 1917, his son Rudd was declared missing and killed in action in Billancourt, France. Sadly, on the 5th of September 1917, the Reverend held a service for members of his congregation who had died and were missing. At that stage, Rudd was believed missing but was actually dead. In 1920, his daughter Maggie died in the flu epidemic. The family moved to a home in Fleet Street, Carlton. The property was called Rutherford in honour of their son, Rudd. In January 1921, the Reverend retired. On 1 February 1921, there was an article of the Reverend's retirement. Amongst the words spoken about the Reverend White said, "There was no one who did not recognise the great work that he has done for the welfare of the church and the people." There was a presentation of a wallet of notes and a silver vase made to the Reverend and his wife Christian from the church people and the residents of Pyrmont. The Reverend replied and spoke touchingly of his days with the church people, many of whom he had seen grow up from little children. He had never been sorry that he had come, and every day brought its pleasures to him. He was sorry to leave, and he hoped to have their company for a time yet. Unfortunately, the Reverend died just 5 months later at his home Rutherford, Fleet Street, Carlton. His obituary said that he had been in failing health for several months and that an accident at his home occurred a few weeks prior, resulting to a fracture of his thighs, which hastened his death. His cause of death was said to be nephritis and senile decay. He was buried at Warrenora Memorial Park and shares a grave monument with his wife Christian, his daughters Maggie and Christine. The tombstone also memorialises his son Rudd. His gravestone reads, "Born Fraserburgh Scotland, minister of the gospel for 46 years, including 36 years at Pyrmont Congregational Church, died 11 July 1921. He died without a will, and intestacy was granted to his wife with an estate valued at around £690. There are so many newspaper articles about the Reverend, his roles in the church, societies and organisations. He married a number of his children, and there is a lovely article about him giving away his daughter Lizzie in September 1903. Unfortunately, the church no longer exists and a motorway stands in its place. In its heyday, the church was significant in size. There were 20 teachers at the Sunday school. The church was patronised by 2 influential families, the Harris and Fairfax families. The Harris family were aldermen and mayors of Sydney. The Fairfax family were prominent Australian media owners and the publishers of the Sydney Morning Herald. During his time at the church, the city of Pyrmont moved from a residential area to an industrial centre, and many worshippers were travelling long distances to attend the Reverend's services. A combination of the change in face of Pyrmont, World War I with 13 men from the congregation dying, and the death of the Reverend himself meant that the church held its last service on the 15th of December 1926. I'll finish this video with the words of Rev James Buchan from the International Congregational Council that he attended in Scotland as the representative of New South Wales. "When I die, I hope I shall be remembered as a preacher of the gospel of Christ. I have to remember that the poorest and most miserable man is my brother." Thank you for watching. As this video is created for family history purposes, it contains direct quotes and documents from the internet.